Your heart will tell you. Your feet touch the threshold of our house of life.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Erica Resnick, Assistant Director of the Temple Emanu-El Streicker Center, and I'm honored and excited to welcome thousands of you to this very special event, part of our Women Inspiring Women series. I want to add a special greeting to the employees of Viacom CBS and their Office of Global Inclusion, our partners on this very special event celebrating Women's History Month. Viacom CBS has long been committed to advancing diversity, inclusion, equity, and belonging. And we are so pleased to welcome their employees for our first of what we hope will be many partnerships together. Thanks to John Streicker and the Streicker family for believing and supporting all that we do. And a very special shout out to our director, Dr. Gotti Levy, the brains behind this and all of our creative offerings. Now to this morning's program. Our moderator is former producer of 60 Minutes, author of 3 books, and frequent moderator at the Streicker Center, Abigail Pogribin. If you have questions you'd like Abby to pose, please submit them via the Zoom chat box, and we will get to as many as we can. We are also proud that this webinar features closed captioning. To activate, click the closed captioning button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and then click Show Subtitle. To introduce our very special guest, who is a personal heroine of mine, please welcome Bridget Streicker.
Hello, Women Inspiring Women. There couldn't be something more fitting. What a description. Everyone has a memory of Hillary Clinton and a feeling and everything that goes with it. In the case of Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton, I'm comfortable that statement is true. We all know her extremely well. We spent decades witnessing, supporting, cheering, and crying for her successes. As a result, I'm not going to detail about her enormous contributions as First Lady, United States Senator, Secretary of State, and the first female candidate to win the popular vote. We recognize her unrivaled experience of leadership with public service and human rights. Instead, I want to introduce you to the way I know her best. She's a loving mother to one of my closest friends. My freshman year at Stanford, I lived down the hall from Chelsea. We became great friends. We lived together for 3 years. I have remained close ever since. And during all those years, I've seen in Secretary Clinton what you're seeing, a strong, compassionate, persistent leader. But I've also experienced a generous, encouraging, practical mentor who has displayed warmth and kindness to me at every turn. Over the years, Secretary Clinton has opened up her home to me on countless occasions, welcomed me on her family's ski trips, and even made me call my own mom when I split my toe open skiing and needed to get stitches. I've played hours of card games, ate family dinners, and danced with a woman who's never needed help remembering names, who's always found time to ask about my work, my family, and what am I doing. She has a magical ability to hop off the plane and devote time to her loved ones. On the practical side as well, I can still remember one day during some event with blisters on my feet, Hillary said, "Girls, I told you, you should always wear shoes you can walk in." And I think of that quite often. Practicality wins. Our lives have changed a lot during this 20-year friendship. But Chelsea and I have become mothers, and Hillary has become a proud grandmother to two. Throughout it, however, Secretary Clinton has always been the go-to person for strength, compassion, and advice. I want you to remember when you listen today, this is a woman with a tremendous heart. She has a clear and solid notion of what is right and has touched my life in countless ways. On behalf of the Temple Emanu-El Streicker Center, I'm honored to present her tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome your moderator, Abby Progan, and my dear friend, Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton.
Hello, everyone, and what a thrill. Thank you so much, Bridget Streicker and Secretary Clinton. I think we can see you now. If we can, there you are. The reveal, that's what we get in the Zoom, the equivalent of you walking on stage. I can hear the applause. I'm sure you can too, coming through virtually. It's great to see you. And I just want to start with how you're doing. This has been a surreal year. I don't know if you're comfortable confessing whether you've been vaccinated, but just to let us know how you've been doing in these last surreal months, which have been surreal for many reasons, obviously, but also very testing of the country.
Well, you're so right about that, Abby. And I want to thank Temple Emanu-El and the Streicker Center for hosting this program during this Women's History Month, and to you for moderating it, and to the many thousands of people who have tuned in. I think we're all looking forward to the end of the lockdown, pandemic, quarantine, whatever we want to refer to this last year. But I've been at home with the exception of attending funerals and one inauguration. I've stayed at home in Westchester County. I've been vaccinated. My husband and I have been part of a public service announcement that I think started maybe today with the other former presidents who have been vaccinated, to urge everybody to be vaccinated as soon as it's possible within whatever state or city you're living. But I think this is fair to say the most testing period that any of us have gone through, Abby. In some ways, it has really forced all of us to dig deep and find ways to strengthen relationships, both in person and virtually. I was delighted to see my friend, Bridget Streicker, on the screen talking about the friendship between her and my daughter. And I'm so grateful that we have the technology to stay in touch, like what we're doing today. But I would also end on a somewhat more serious, but I think hopeful note. Let's learn from what we've gone through this past year. Let's try to keep in mind what's really important in our lives, maybe jettison some of the stuff that isn't and concentrate on what is. Let's support uniting our country. Let's try to figure out how we're going to go into a future that is fairer, juster, better for everybody. And resume a place of leadership in the world on behalf of eternal values. So I'm excited about the future, but I'm hoping that we all think hard about what we're going to take with us into it.
You just said you're excited about the future. I think listening to your podcast, which I recommend for everyone who hasn't discovered it yet, it's more intimate, it's more casual, it's more fun, and it's more varied in a way than I think I'll admit I expected. These are really, it feels like we're at your kitchen table with these folks, whether you're talking to Tony Blinken or Amanda Gorman or Kerry Washington. And it feels like these conversations, it's not an accident that maybe you started having them now. It feels like you're in a way communicating that our teachers are everywhere, and even particularly in this time, because a lot of what you're getting at in these conversations is what people have been dealing with, and that many were dispirited in these last 4 years. Can you just touch on the podcast, kind of what was the idea behind it? Are you enjoying it? It's obviously a lot of preparation, but it's a different side of Secretary Clinton, I would say.
Abby, I'm loving it. I was asked to do a podcast, some time back, and I just sort of put it aside. But then during the pandemic, I was asked again, and I thought, wow, I'm going to do this because I want to have conversations about what we're going through, what we're learning, how we are processing everything that's happening, not only the pandemic, but the protests, the racial reckoning over the killing of George Floyd and others, an election that was going to be truly momentous for the country, so many issues. So I started up in my attic office in my old farmhouse here in Chappaqua last fall, and I've really enjoyed the conversations. I get a lot out of them. The podcast is called You and Me Both because I found myself saying to my friends when they would say, this is both exhausting but also, very deepening. I'd say, yeah, you and me both. We're having this incredible collective experience. And what I have found in these conversations, and I've tried to make it varied, I try to talk to people that I'm inspired by or I'm interested in, and it is intimate. They're very intimate conversations about what we're feeling, what we're learning, because I think we all need that right now. We need a sense that we're in this together. We're not alone. When I was talking to Amanda Gorman after her remarkable poem at the inauguration, I really felt like, she had the ability with her magical sense of words and the poet she is, to capture a lot of those feelings. So for me, it's been personally very rewarding, and I'm excited that so many people have engaged with it. And one little factoid, Abby, is that we have a very short attention span in today's world, and I'm told by iHeart, who produces and partners with me on it, that people stay for 30 and 40-minute conversations, which I think shows that we're all kind of hungry to really engage with each other. So thank you for listening, and I hope others tune in. And if they've got any ideas, let me know, because I'm always looking for not just the well-known guests, but people out of the way that somebody refers to me.
And one of the things that I think also comes across is your humor, which I think historically a lot of people have not known is there.
That's true.
I think mistakenly. And it's clearly off the cuff. I mean, this is all, you're live, and you were talking to Governor Gretchen Whitmer, and you said, as somebody who's also been burned in effigy, because she has been so attacked, and you obviously have managed to weather such ridiculous kind of ugliness over the years. It's even when you were talking to Nancy Pelosi, it just struck me that I think we're in a place now, post these years, where we see that women not only can survive the kind of disproportionate attention and anger, but there is some solidarity in getting through it and holding steady on leadership. Can you just address a little bit of that before we take you back to your childhood, and when you have these conversations with those who are experiencing it anew, like a Gretchen Whitmer, how in a way, whether it's your podcast or other ways, you want to kind of give them strength to stay the course?
It's a great question, Abby. And I think particularly with the two women you mentioned, starting first with Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan, what she went through with the assault on her capital, which happened, months before the assault on our national capital, with armed, militia members, white supremacists, neo-Nazis, the whole range of those who showed up armed, fully armed, to intimidate her because she was doing her very best to keep the people she governed alive during this pandemic. And then for her to be told there was an actual plot to kidnap her and execute her by some of these same groups and individuals. She handled it with enormous grace. And I have to add, the Attorney General of Michigan, also a woman, the Secretary of State of Michigan, also a woman. They have been extraordinary leaders during such a tumultuous time. And Governor Whitmer never lost her focus on what she was supposed to be doing, which was protecting and speaking for the people that she represented. But when I spoke with her on my podcast, I think that came through, that she was aware of the threats that had been made against her, but she didn't let it deter her. And someone else who's been like that for a long time is Nancy Pelosi, who has been also vilified repeatedly for passing the Affordable Care Act, for standing up and deciding that regrettably Trump needed to be impeached, not once but twice. She has weathered so many storms, and she's been a really steady ship throughout them all. So when I talked to her the other day on my podcast, again, I shared how much I admired her strength and leadership. And as is so typical of Speaker Pelosi, she said, well, I owe it to the people I represent. I'm standing with them and for them, both
And
in her
to you,
district.
and to you. She owed
Yeah.
it to you as well.
Yeah, but I think there is a greater awareness now, and this is what I would end with. I often felt when I was, running for president, for example, that both in 2008 and in 2016, I was, somewhat of an oddity, and it caused a lot of cognitive dissonance, I think, in people, not sure exactly how they were supposed to view me, how they were supposed to handle my desire to be elected president. It was really a reflection of literally thousands of years of attitudes and beliefs about women in positions of authority. But now I feel like somehow the fever has broken a little. And obviously we have our first woman vice president with Kamala Harris. And I'm really personally gratified that, it's not just me and, for all my, faults and strengths and everything that I come in the package of that, people can try to figure out. Now there's enough women out there that people can say, hey, maybe I can start evaluating women in leadership the way I evaluate men who come in all sizes and shapes and backgrounds. So I do think we're making progress. We can't rest because there still is a lot of work to do, but that is gratifying with people like Governor Whitmer and Speaker Pelosi in leadership today. Along with,
and I certainly don't want to make light of when I mentioned that you can commiserate about the onslaught. But what I think is a sign of that humor is that you can also laugh at the absurdity and extremism of it. I think that also signals that we've turned a page in a way that people are beginning to see the almost cartoonish version of this and not accepting it anymore and not being silent about it anymore. Humor can be.
I have to add, Hulu produced a documentary about me called Hillary, obviously.
Incredible.
But I had forgotten, or maybe I should say I had repressed being burned in effigy over my efforts to help our country get to universal health care back in the 90s. And the fantastic director, Nanette Bernstein, found it and put it in the film. So when I first saw the film, I thought, oh my gosh, yeah, I was burned in effigy. I'm kind of used to being, attacked and threatened and all the stuff that goes with it. And of course, social media has very much amplified that. So you have to have a sense of humor. I mean, you cannot be in the public arena today with all of the cross currents that are at work and not both be humble, but also have a sense of humor as you try to speak out or advance a cause. And so, it is important. And I obviously try to do a lot of that on my podcast, but luckily most of the people I talk to have good senses of humor, Abby. So they get me laughing because of, their observations as well.
So let's just go back a little bit to sort of the founding blocks of Hillary Clinton. And I want to talk about your mom at first, because I know it's a bit of a cliche to say that your mom was an inspiration, but she runs through your books and your interviews and the documentary, which everyone should watch. It's extraordinary for a million reasons, besides being just so beautifully done. it's just that she was an important thread. I think her strength, her backstory, which a lot of people I think to this day don't really understand, and I know we don't have a lot of time to really go into it, but how does she stay with you today? If you can talk about your childhood and what you think you got from her.
Well, she's a constant inspiration and source of strength to me because, as you said, she had such a different upbringing than I did. She was basically abandoned when she was 8 years old by her own parents, who were too young and unready to be parents in Chicago, and sent by herself in charge of her 5-year-old sister. And that image always gets me, the idea of two little girls being put on a train in Chicago back in what would have been the 1920s, all the way to Los Angeles, where she lived with her paternal grandparents, who were, just very difficult, especially her paternal grandmother. So that by the age of 13, she was out of that house. She was working as a babysitter, housekeeper in someone else's house. And years later, when I was old enough to understand the deprivation, the abandonment, I would be marveling that she turned out as solid and responsible and loving as she did. And I would ask her, Abby, and this was, when I was in my teens and had some idea of what she'd gone through, because when I was a little girl, all I knew was she was my mom, and she was a great mom. She said something to me that I've always thought of. And that is that along the way, people showed her kindness. And it seems like such a simple thing, but I have to tell you, the older I get, the more important it becomes. The first grade teacher who knew she didn't have any lunch, and they used to, in those old days, eat in the classroom, and the children would bring something from home, and then they would pay a penny for a little bit of milk. And the teacher, without embarrassing her, would say, "Oh, Dorothy, I just have too much food today. Would you like some?" And she was only, 6 years old, but she realized years later that the teacher was feeding her. Or even the woman whose house she went to work in, who said to her one day, "Would you like to go to high school?" And my mother loved education. Till the day she died, she was self-educating all the time. She said, "Yes, I would really like to go." She would have been a freshman, but of course wasn't going to school because she was working. And this woman said to her, "If you can get up early and take care of my children and get them off to school, I'm happy to have you go to high school, but you have to come right back." That sounds harsh to our ears, but to my mother, it was a gift of kindness. So she'd get up and she'd literally run to high school to get there on time, and then she'd run home to meet the children when they got home from school. But it was a great kindness to her. And when we were growing up, she tried to help abused children. She tried to help girls who similarly were kicked out of their homes or were abandoned. So it wasn't only her strength of character that kind of got her through her own life, but her understanding that there were other people she could help because she had survived and been able to make a good life for herself. So I think about her literally every day.
And you said that actually gender, when you were growing up, was not so significant. This was in your wonderful memoir, What Happened, or I consider it partly memoir. Gender was not significant when you were a kid, except for when you wanted to work at NASA, or a friend told you that you couldn't run for class president. Do you remember kind of when gender began to kind of figure into thinking?
Well, those two things. My father was a typical product of the Great Depression of World War II, where he was a chief petty officer in the Navy. And yet the great gift my father gave me was of high expectations without any limitation because of gender. I never, ever remember my father saying, "You can't do that because you're a girl," or "You shouldn't do that because you're a girl." As if I wanted to go out and play, softball or baseball with the boys, or I wanted to, go up to the park and ice skate with them, or whatever it was I wanted to do, it was all fine with him as long as I took school, seriously, and as long as I, helped my mother around the house, basically. So it wasn't until I was in, I guess I was in 8th grade, and I was fascinated by the space program and maybe going into space. And so I wrote to NASA and I said, "Well, how do you become an astronaut?" And the letter I got back was, sorry, we're not taking girls. Now, this was years before Sally Ride was our first woman in space. That was the first time anybody had said to me, you can't do something because you're a girl. And I remember telling my father, and he said, don't listen to those people. Do whatever you want to do. I mean, he was very egalitarian in that way, even though he was terribly old-fashioned in other ways. And yes, you're right. You know, when I wanted to run for, I guess it was class president, I can't remember, you know, people, both boys and girls, said, oh, no, you can be secretary, but only a boy can be president. So there were those experiences, but you know, being told that girls couldn't be astronauts, even though, let's be honest, Abby, I was, you know, very myopic. I couldn't see very well, and I was hardly the best physical specimen. So the idea that I could have ever been an astronaut was certainly not in the cards, but the idea that I was told I couldn't because I was a girl was just unacceptable to me.
And you also talked about how representation of women became more and more important to you, and particularly when you became a mom. That you wanted to be able to read books to Chelsea that had women doing interesting, strong, varied things. Didn't necessarily always find those books. So you both wrote one, which I think a lot of people also are not aware of. Can you just talk a little bit about why? And again, just because we're time constrained, just make sure you say the title so people can find it themselves. Is it intended for young people?
It is. It's really intended for all ages, and both women and men, boys and girls. I think our primary audience are girls and women, but it's called The Book of Gutsy Women. And it came about because I've talked with Chelsea since she was a toddler about how she could do anything and girls could do anything, the same kind of messages that I got growing up. But they were delivered in a very different time, because when I was growing up, literally the only women I knew who worked outside the home were my teachers in my public schools and my librarians in my public library. I didn't know other women. So I lived for stories about other women. And some of the people on this Zoom may remember Life magazine, which is no longer around, but in my house, it came every Friday afternoon, and I'd come home from school and I'd lie on my living room floor and I'd take that great big magazine and I'd read it. And it was in those pages that I met Amelia Earhart or Margaret Burke White or Maria Tolchiff or, people who were, just in the public eye, like Margaret Chase Smith, who was the first Republican senator to stand up to Joe McCarthy. I met these women vicariously. By the time Chelsea was a little girl, her pediatrician was a woman, the mayor of Little Rock was a woman. So we had different experiences, but we both realized we took inspiration from women we considered gutsy, women who we looked up to, women who we either knew of because they were contemporaries in the current public eye, or they were figures from the past. And as we began talking, we thought, wow, we want to do something that gives parents and grandparents more role models and examples that they can use with their daughters and sons.
And Chelsea also runs through your book, I think, in a really moving way as someone who's inspired you. And
yes.
it's wonderful and sometimes rare to give birth to the people that ultimately affect you, in a way that I think she has. Can you just talk about what you mean by that and what your friendship is like today, knowing obviously that for those of us who have Jewish mothers, you're a very Jewish mother, but as objectively as you can describe it.
I'm inspired by my daughter, whom I actually really admire, in addition to, loving extraordinarily. She's just a person who knows who she is and lives by, the strongest set of values. She is incredibly honest. She is incredibly generous and kind. She's obviously, super smart and well-educated. But, I went to the funeral of Vernon Jordan a day ago, and in reading a lot of the coverage of this great friend of ours and a civil rights leader, I ran across a phrase I'd never heard before, Abby, which was eulogy virtues. And what the writer meant was, at the end of the day, you can list somebody's accomplishments. They were president of that. They were, a leader here. They made this much money. They did all of this. But at the end of the day, it's these, quote, eulogy virtues. Like, what kind of person was he or she? How do people remember that person? And my daughter exhibits those virtues in her daily life, as a busy mom, as a, associate professor, as somebody involved in the public, private, not-for-profit sector as she is. So I take a lot of inspiration. I had one child, Chelsea. She has 3 children, and the idea that she manages all of this and it's just an amazing accomplishment. And as many of your viewers may know or may not, her husband is Jewish. So they are very intentional about, making sure that their kids are really well aware of their traditions. Both Chelsea and Mark are very serious about faith. And, before the pandemic, they would celebrate all of the holidays. They would go to synagogue. They would also go to church. And I asked a child psychiatrist who's a friend of mine one time, I said, well, Mark and Chelsea are balancing, raising their children in both their faiths. What do you think? And he said, I think it's a gift. I think it's a gift because too many children are raised without faith. And it's really hard to have no faith. But if you've got intentional parenting that says, we want you to understand and be able to make intelligent choices about faith, that's a gift. And I feel like that's what they've given my grandchildren, and I'm very proud of that.
And I know that it's a question you're probably weary of, this work-life balance for women, but I think people are understandably fascinated by how you do it, how you did it. And it struck me in your book how honest you were about how much you thought and worried about whether Chelsea would feel like she was prioritized, that she was the priority, and that you chose to bring her into the work and not just have the work separate, that you had these conversations about what you were doing, that she traveled with you as much as possible. And that in some ways it was her speech actually at the convention that was just, you knew it, but it was kind of a reminder of how what she took away from that childhood, from that upbringing. Can you speak to that a bit?
Well, Abby, I know your mom, and you've got a busy mom. I've known your mom for decades, and she's always been involved in the world outside the home, as well as adoring her children. It is a constant balancing act. And honestly, if a mother doesn't feel guilty, she's not paying attention to how she's feeling, because there's no way not to end up feeling guilty about some kind of imbalance. You're not doing enough. You're doing, too little when you should be paying more attention at home. But then what are you doing outside of the home? It is still one of the biggest burdens that working parents, particularly working moms, face. And we've seen that so dramatically during this pandemic. Think of all the women who've lost their jobs, who've had to leave their jobs because their children were at home and trying to go to Zoom school. And it's been inordinately stressful on so many mothers. So I think that you do the best you can. You can't beat yourself up as long as you are paying attention. And I guess that goes to your question. You can't be indifferent to the choices you're making every day. You have to pay attention. And I never stopped thinking about my daughter, no matter what I was doing or where I was. I never stopped thinking about, okay, when's the next, well child pediatrician visit? When's the next parent teacher conference? When's the next play date that I can arrange? I was constantly thinking about that. So she never left my mind. Even though I would, go out into the world as a lawyer or in any other of my various roles. And that's what and not every woman makes the same decisions at the same time during her life. Nancy Pelosi's the first to tell you she did not go into elected politics with her 5 children until her youngest was in high school. And, she
50.
said,
She was
yeah,
50.
she was.
I couldn't believe when you said that on your podcast. That shocked me.
And so, she took a different route. I know other women who get into politics or high-powered corporate jobs, from literally the moment that they're giving birth. I also, on my podcast, which hasn't been broadcast yet, talked with Tammy Duckworth, the senator from Illinois. She was the first senator ever in the history of our country to give birth while she was a senator. So people have to sort of build their own lives in ways that fit them and their partners and their kids and their extended family. And we all have to support each other. I guess that's what I would stress. It's hard and it's complicated out there. And, I try to help Chelsea as much now as a grandmother, can without being, too interfering, and try to be there for her and her kids.
We have a million questions that we're going to get to, but I just want to have you sort of sit with them for a minute without humility and acknowledge that you are the inspiration for so many people. It's just factual. You've given them a sense of what's possible, and you've given them a sense of what's survivable. But it's for those of us who have daughters, particularly who are thinking about public service and also see the gauntlet that it requires. It can be daunting. You quote Eleanor Roosevelt in one of your chapters, "A woman is like a tea bag. You can't tell how strong she is until you put her in hot water," which I loved. You've been in a lot of hot water, more frankly than when people turning up the heat when it was completely unjustified. But just not to go back to resilience again, but you talk a lot in your book about this word authenticity, likability, the hyper scrutiny on your outfits, on your hair, on your everything, your makeup, etc. I love that you devoted a chapter to just like snacks on the plane. Like, if you all want to know this stuff, I'm going to tell you what we ate on the plane. I got those bars, by the way. They're terrific.
Yeah, they are.
But in a way you were sort of saying, okay, you have this fascination with how I get up in the morning and do my hair. I'm going to tell you in one chapter. Mm-hmm. But there is a sense of you had almost impossible strength. And that for those who would think about service now, you've obviously inspired so many. Look at 2018, look at the results. What do you tell those who are thinking about service and thinking about the slings and arrows that are inevitable, particularly for women?
Well, this is a constant conversation that I have with young people, particularly young women, because I want them to feel that if it's their calling, if it's the purpose they want to fulfill in their own lives, not to be afraid of it, but to be very clear-eyed and realistic about what they are getting into, because there is a double standard. We've made progress, but let's be very clear, not enough. And you have to be prepared for those slings and arrows. You have to be able to have enough confidence in yourself not to get knocked down, but to also listen to legitimate criticism. I used to say all the time, take criticism seriously, but not personally, because there are too many people who would just knock you down for their own reasons. So you can't just get into that. You have to be somewhat discerning. But I hope that young people, and I've got an organization called Onward Together, and we support groups that are recruiting, young people, women, people of color, people who want to get into the public arena, maybe run for office themselves. And we try to support them, but be honest with them. If you're scared of public speaking and you can't get over it, you can't train and practice yourself out of it, you're probably better behind the scenes, because you're going to have to speak to people. If you are self-conscious about how you appear and you can't get relaxed or confident enough about it, either keep working on that or, decide that, again, you have to be behind the scenes. But let's be really honest while we're encouraging, and that's what I've tried to do.
And one of the moments, please take a drink of water, Secretary. We want you to stay hydrated. In your book, and in a documentary, which is amazing, you talk about the moment where Trump was stalking you in the debate. And to me, it was a metaphor for so much of what happens, whether you have someone hulking behind you or not, is that choice as to whether to call it out and maybe risk seeming angry, too angry, or to let it go and just do as you had You had obviously prepared. You took us off. You knew the policy. You knew the programs. You knew why you cared and wanted to be president. But at that moment, you had to make a decision. And to this day, you're not sure you made the right one. But because I think it is a metaphor, can you just address how we weigh a moment like that?
I put it in that book, What Happened, Abby, for just that reason, because it may not happen in front of, 90 million people on a stage that the entire world is watching, but it often happens in other circumstances for a lot of women, and particularly young women who are just getting started in their work lives. But for me, I was thinking through every possible response. He was, looming over me. He was leering. He was, demonstrating alpha male dominance. And I knew that there was, let's be clear, a significant portion of the audience that would love that. That group of people who are either skeptical or downright negative about, women becoming president, for example. The idea that he was exhibiting that kind of behavior would be a real message to them. And I knew there were others, also a big group of women who would immediately see what I felt, like, what is he doing and why, and what's this about? And I did think, well, maybe I should just spin on my heel and say, you're not going to intimidate me. Back off, you creep. And I thought about that very, very much. In the end, I decided, look, I'm damned if I do and I'm damned if I don't. If I in any way take him on, it will come across to a lot of people, and particularly, sadly, to the press, as though I can't handle the pressure, that I'm not prepared to be in the Oval Office making life or death decisions because I can't ignore and deal with one guy, peering over me. And I knew that it was a risk to go either way, but I decided, look, if I were looking for a president, I would want somebody who was calm, cool, and collected, not, emotionally displaying the kind of behavior he was. And therefore, I'm going to go on as I would in any circumstance, making my case, ignoring him, and letting the audience draw their own conclusion. It was an incredible moment. Now, to go back to what we were talking about just earlier, I kind of think now that we have more women in the public arena with, all of the differences that they presented, like they did in the Democratic primary this past season. I think a woman who could practice for that and who was able to, puncture it with humor and firmness might be able to get away with it now. It still is a bit of an open question because, there's downsides, but I wanted to write about it so that, women could see themselves in that and think through their own responses.
Dara is asking, I'm grateful to Secretary Clinton for inspiring more women to run for office. How do we support women electeds and make sure they are successful in governing as they are in campaigning? And as you know, Secretary Clinton, we have so many now that we're going to try to do almost like a rapid fire. I don't want to over-condense.
Right. I think, look, we are also now learning that not every woman deserves your support. Let's be, very upfront about that. There are some women who, it appears, were cheering on the insurrection against the Capitol, some women who voted against certifying the election. So we're now having enough women in public life that be careful about who you choose to support. Support women who represent your values, who represent your position on issues. But when they are elected, stand with them. And in our system, do what you can to speak up for them and support them in every way.
And I love, again, that you're pointing out we want to get to the place where we're judging a woman on her leadership and character and not
That's right.
gender. Rhea is asking, can you address your mental health? Your mental health and how you were able to cope during these difficult times.
Well,
I thought you were talking about mental health policy, which I know you also have prioritized, so I was confused. But she's asking about your own.
well, first, I have to give my parents credit. Let me start there because, they gave me a lot of confidence. They showed me a lot of support for my decisions early on. And, I don't think anything ever replaces that. Trying to give a child a sense of stability and security is such a great gift. And so start with that. But then I think, you have to know what you believe, and you have to understand that when you get into the public arena, in large measure, it's no longer about you. I left being Secretary of State with it's huge approval rating, something like 67, 69% approval. And the other side knew that they had to bring me down if they were going to defeat me. And they had a lot of tools at their disposal. They had social media, they had disinformation, they had just outright lies. And they repeated and repeated. And I was, not as effective in rebutting as I could. But I always knew they were lying. I always knew that they were afraid of me and knew that I could win and become the first woman president and hold them to account. And so they unleashed, the Russians and everybody else against me. So I have a pretty clear idea of my strengths and, yes, my weaknesses, and what's true and I know it's not true. So I've been, lucky to be able to have a pretty strong character and sense of self going through everything that I've experienced.
Allison is asking, what lessons can you impart to Vice President Harris? What would be your biggest advice to her personally and as a public servant?
I've had the privilege of knowing Kamala for a number of years. I've spoken with her. I stay in touch with her. I think she's doing exactly what is required right now. She is a strong partner to the president. She is reaching out on his and her behalf and on behalf of the country to foreign leaders on issues that are important. She's really learning the job. It's very difficult to be thrown into a situation like the one that the president and vice president inherited with so many problems. So I think she's studying and learning, educating and preparing herself. And she needs, our support because she's, in a very challenging position. But I think they're off to a good start. I think the Biden-Harris team has really demonstrated maturity, modeled good behavior, and made a difference already.
Robin is saying Obama in his memoir talks about how effective you were as Secretary of State, traveling everywhere, commanding the respect of other countries. Do you miss being in that fray?
Oh, of course. I would go back in a minute because I believe so strongly in not only what we need to do here at home, but also around the world. It was a huge surprise and a great honor when then President-elect Obama asked me to be Secretary of State. And those 4 years made a big difference. And then, of course, a lot of it was discarded or overlooked in the following 4 years. And so I'm in close touch with the Biden team as they try to, rebuild our standing. And we could talk about this, and maybe sometime we will, Abby, about where we stand in the world and what our challenges are, because they're very difficult ones, between what's happening globally with the pandemic and with climate change and all the other problems we have to solve globally. China's, quite aggressive rise now and some of what it's doing, and on we could go. So yes, I miss it. I was honored to serve, and now I'm supporting those who are going on with the job.
It must have been a lot of jet lag.
It was a lot of jet lag. I didn't even know how tired I was till I stopped after 112 countries and nearly 1 million miles.
Jill is asking what's your favorite thing about being a grandma? Now you're 3 times over.
I mean, it is so.
Don't get her started.
I know. Don't get me started. I cannot tell you. It is an experience that you cannot overrate, and you cannot understand until you're in the midst of it. Seeing your child become a parent, I mean, watching my child parent my grandchildren is a joy beyond words. Spending time with them, which we have been lucky enough to do, especially during the big snow that we had so much fun together. I find it a joy, and there's nothing I wouldn't do for, my grandchildren. And I know grandparents feel that way, but I also know I want to do what I can to make sure the country and the world they come of age in is going to be the kind of place I want for my grandchildren and all children.
Quite a few people are asking about the divisions that were laid bare in the last 4 years, and we have obviously only touched on, we could do a whole hour on the siege of the Capitol. But to those who are asking how we heal, and not, I think, as a saccharine question, but as a really hard place to be right now. You often talk about being optimistic, but it was very hard for many of us to see what has been exposed and to know how we somehow come together.
Yeah, no, I think, Abby, this is the work of all of us, not just our leaders, but it has to start with leaders. And here's what I'm encouraged by. If you look at this COVID relief bill that was just passed, even though not a single Republican in either the House or the Senate voted for it, the percentage of Americans, including Republicans and independents, who favor it is, in the high 60s. I mean, people are almost exhaling and saying, wow, you know what? We have a president again who actually cares whether we live or die. We have a president again who actually cares whether my job is there or not, or my small business can survive. This is the way to rebuild some sense of confidence and trust in what we can do together. And I regret deeply, I said this in an interview with the Washington Post the other day, I regret deeply that the Republican Party has been captured by the most extremist fringe and seems to be unable to rid itself of that. Because I would love to see, members that I served with when I was in the Senate for 8 years, working across the aisle. And maybe on some other things they will, I hope. But meanwhile, we've got a president in Joe Biden who is just steady as you go. He's not, entertaining us. He's not putting on a reality show. He's getting up every day. He's doing the work. I mean, he even said he wasn't going to wait to send out the checks that have been passed until he could put his name on them. Well, that's a sign of maturity, and we need mature leadership and mature citizenship right now. And so I think all of us have a role to play in electing and frankly rewarding leaders who do the hard work of trying to solve problems again, not being, kind of narcissistic game players. And if we do that, I think, we can make slow and steady progress. There will probably always be a fringe that frankly is, dangerous and threatening because of what they believe, but we can make them a smaller and smaller fringe if we all support the kind of leadership we're getting now.
Secretary Clinton, people want to know what you're reading. We're getting a bunch of questions on that. You introduced me to that great mystery writer.
Oh, Louise Penny. Yes. Well, I highly recommend Louise Penny for two reasons. One, her series set in Quebec is just unbelievably engrossing and wonderful company. And she and I are writing a political thriller together, which has been great fun for me. And the main character is a Secretary of State. So I bring the experience. She brings the expertise. I'll tell you what I'm reading and I'm going to be interviewing for my podcast is Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, which even though I obviously am aware of and have been, really worried about the division over race and some of what we've seen in the effort to suppress voters and all the rest of it, Isabel Wilkerson brings such a unique perspective by placing our racial history into the context of caste. And it's brilliant. So I'm reading that as well.
I'm lucky enough to interview her next week about Cass. So I totally agree with you. Dagmar is asking, which I know is hard in the last couple minutes, what has been your greatest joy and your greatest disappointment?
Oh, the greatest joy has been both, my family, my motherhood, my grandmotherhood, and also serving my country. I mean, those to me are part and parcel in many ways of the same motivation to try to, make life better for somebody, try to do my part. I have been deeply saddened and shaken by the divisiveness we've seen, the meanness, the hatred. The attack on the Capitol was beyond shocking to me. The idea this could happen in our country, that people would be instigated to become insurrectionists against everything we stand for, our democracy. That was such a profoundly sad and shocking moment. And like everyone of goodwill, I'm hoping that we hold those accountable who either instigated or participated in it, and that we make it very clear that, yes, in our democracy, we have strengths and weaknesses, we have agreements and disagreements, but there are proper ways to proceed. And instigating violence and hatred is beyond the pale. And so I'm going to continue to speak out and do everything I can to try to get people to work together across whatever divides us going forward.
Secretary of Clinton, before I hand it back over to Erica Resnick, with thanks to Gotti Levy, the impresario of the Streicker Center, and the Streicker family for their generosity and their trust in me as a moderator, I want to just end with one of your quotes. You said, "I believe that part of the reason we're on this earth is to do what we can to make life better, fairer, more just. That motivates me. Does it get discouraging? Do you feel like you want to pull the covers over your head? Yes. But it's just not how I'm made. And it's not what I think this country that I love and I've tried to serve should stand for. So I get back in the fray. And we're so grateful that you do and you have. Thank you for this time. Thank you for everyone who signed on. And Erica, I'm handing it over to you.
Thanks, Abby. On behalf of everyone who tuned in, I just wanted to thank Secretary Clinton and Abby for imparting us with such wisdom and inspiration. And a big thank you to our audience for tuning in to celebrate strong women everywhere. We hope you'll join us again soon, and have a lovely day.
Thank you all.
Thank you.